My baby dolls, we're back again. This time, Passover's tonight, but by the time you listen to this show, it will have already been re-recorded, and it will probably be the tail end of Passover that you'll be getting this. But today we have a great show on Genesis. We got Paul Dickson, whose new book, Leo Durocher, Baseball's Prodigal Son, has just been published. It's doing extremely well. It is the definitive biography of Leo Durocher. Before I even begin the show, I have to tell you, go out, purchase it. It is full of fantastic facts. We're going to get into the book with Paul Dickson today, but I'm not going to try to give you too much away because we want you to buy the book. But this is well-researched. It's definitely a labor of love, and it tells a lot about Leo Durocher, which I didn't know a lot, and we'll get with Paul Dickson shortly. You are listening to my show, Genesis, on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. And again, talking about Leo Durocher. And Leo Durocher, baseball's prodigal son, probably before the times many of you remember Billy Barton or Earl Weaver, there was Leo Durocher. And we're going to get into his life, his career, spanning from the 1920s right into the 1970s. And Paul Dickson, it's an honor to have him on the show. He's written more than 65 books, and that's going back to 1971. And his book on Bill Veeck, baseball's greatest man, award for the best baseball book of the year. In 2010, the Dickson Baseball Dictionary was named the Wall Street Journal as one of the 5 best baseball books ever written. Dickson also wrote the classic narrative history of Sputnik, and I wasn't around when Sputnik was there. And I was born in 70, and Sputnik, I think, was in 57, the shock of the century, and co-authored with Thomas Allen, The Bonus Army, an epic, American epic. And I believe that's with MacArthur and the World War I veterans that tried to get their pensions during the March on Washington. They were all living in Coovervilles, and MacArthur, that's a huge blemish on MacArthur. He had to come in and drive them all out. And, of course, Paul lives with his wife, Nancy, and Garrett Pott, Maryland. Without any further ado, welcome to the show, Mr. Dickson.
Thank you, sir. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, I didn't butcher you too much in my introduction.
No, that was nice.
All right. That's what I like to do, mate.
You made me sound like John Steinbeck or something.
You know, you are.
No.
You're a guy that wrote 65 books, and you know, and I know you've written, 3 baseball books out of your arsenal of library that you have written?
I've probably written a dozen baseball books, but it's not, I mean, the fact is, all I do is I take out the trash, I raise kids, and I write books, you know. So that's what I do.
You're a lot like me. I'm a lawyer. I spend my time in libraries, spend my time writing, and I spend my time researching.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, now look, I think you spent, I read somewhere, because I've done my homework on you, you spent about 2 years researching Leo. How is that going? How does that go to begin with?
It's really wonderful because there's a lot of sports. This sounds self-serving, but I'm going to say it anyhow. A lot of sports books, they basically, guys just look at the record book, they look at the baseball encyclopedia, they pick up a couple, you know, have access to maybe a database like the New York Times or something, and they write the book. But what I try to do with it, reading a sports biography, such as the Bill Veeck book and this Leo Durocher book, is I approach it like a mainstream, you know, big biographer really looking for acclaim in the sense of other biographers saying, man, he really did his homework. So a lot of what I did here, and a lot of the most important stuff I found was the papers of Branch Rickey, who was with Durocher in St. Louis and then in Brooklyn. The papers of Arthur Mann, who was this journalist for the New York World who befriended Leo Durocher, the papers of Jackie Robinson, who was, of course, brought up by Leo. And I also I was able to get a hold of old newspaper morgue files. These were bags of clippings, all related to Durocher, but they were not just from the big papers, but they were from the tabloids. And I went through the microfilm of the Daily Worker, because it's one of the first times Durocher gets in trouble with the commissioner is something he gives in an interview with the Daily Worker. Your younger listeners won't know this, but the Daily Worker was the communist daily newspaper in Manhattan, which had a spectacular sports department. They had great writers working for them. So that's what it's like. It's digging the stuff, and I enjoy the research as much as the writing, or as much as the promotion, like I'm doing right now.
Yeah, you had some book signings I saw in the last few weeks, and I think the publishers ordered another round of books to be produced and shipped out because it's been selling well. The two words that writers love the most, book writers, is second printing. It means that whole first run is gone or in the pipeline, and they're going to restock. That means restocking, at the bookstores and stuff. And writers hate first editions because it means they didn't go very far. No, I know. And let me ask you this. What got you interested in Leo? About how many years ago?
Well, at first, there are two answers to that. But one answer is, I was born in 1939, and I grew up in Yonkers, a block out of the Bronx, and my whole neighborhood growing up was full of baseball. In 1944, my uncle came back from the South Pacific, and in his full uniform with the medals on his chest. And in 44, in September, he takes me to Yankee Stadium, and the war is still on. And the guys at the turnstiles, they open it up. They say, "Come on in, fellas." The two of us, and one of the ushers took us down to the Yankee clubhouse, and Tommy Henrik is in there, who's in the Coast Guard, and he and my uncle they both have that same sailor uniform with a Dixie cup hat and the traditional sailor's uniform, and then they take us down to the owner's box. And I'm sitting there with Tommy Hendricks and my uncle, and they're both in uniform, and the vendors are giving us free food. And I said to my uncle, "I love this game." Well, I grew up with that whole New York thing where, you had the Dodgers, and my great-grandfather was a partner of Charlie Ebbets. So there was a big thing in the family about the Dodgers, the Yankees. I get free passes from Bill Dickey's nephew. We would get passes to Yankee games. We could go free. And the Giants were a big factor as well. And so it was just like growing up in paradise, because in a baseball world, it was unbelievable. In the papers every day, there was almost every day, not every day, but Leo is all over the papers, because there's 9 dailies when he's in 9 dailies in the city of New York, daily newspapers. And, you grew up with Leo, and there'd be these pictures on the tabloids, the Mirror, the News, and the Post, these huge pictures of Leo screaming at umpires, or, usually screaming up at an umpire who'd be taller than he was. So I loved that period. And then when I got thinking about Leo, who was not necessarily the most likable guy in the world, I realized he covers this period. He goes to the Yankees first in 1925. He plays his last game as a player in 45, but then as a manager goes all the way through to the post-Apollo moon landing Houston Astros. So he's got a big chunk of baseball history in this one man.
And it's funny because you've written books on space, so the timeline's going, like I mentioned before, after World War I, right into the 1970s.
Yeah. And Prohibition.
Now, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
And Prohibition. But Leo still drank, I think, during Prohibition, like most of them did.
Oh yeah.
Let Let me ask this: as opposed to online, about how much of your research is, say, online as opposed to going down and going to, like, say, the Library of Congress or something like that? Where's most of your research come from, Leo?
Oh, it's at the Library of Congress. And what people don't realize is, but I'm going online down there. Most of the primary research material is not online, or if it is online, it's in these databases, which are extraordinarily expensive. So, for example, the big newspaper databases are extraordinarily expensive. So I have to go to the Library of Congress all the time because they cost money. And you know, there's less and less online now in terms of primary research material, not secondary stuff, than there was probably 5 years ago. There's more stuff in there that's debatable and questionable. Things like Wikipedia, which is just a treasure trove of errors. But you still have to do a lot of research. A lot of the stuff I was doing was for old news, physical clips, and a huge amount from microfilm. You cannot get the Daily Worker, for example, online. You've got to go, or it doesn't exist in any digital form. You have to go down, and I went down to NYU, where all the communist archives are in New York City, New York University, and go through. I was literally going down through the microfilm looking for stuff on Leo, and because Leo was he was associated very popular with the far left in Manhattan, and Brooklyn was at that time when he came up through Brooklyn. He was the Brooklyn had a sort of feistiness and they loved Leo. Leo was a fighter. He was and he was sort of fit in with the ethnicities of Brooklyn. Somebody asked him once. They said, "Leo, are you Jewish?" And he said, "No," but he said, "Durocher rhymes with kosher."
Oh, that's great.
But he was what's interesting to me about him too was he was an uneducated. I mean, he never made it to high school. Never made it out of whatever goes before high school back then. But he's got this ability with language and with being able to hurl insults, give after dinner speeches. He has this terseness about him, and he ends up as a comic. He's on Mr. Ed and the Munsters and all these shows. And it's a sort of amazing guy who sort of learned the rhythm of language on his own without being taught.
And let me ask you this, Paul. When you're with the microfiche and all that stuff, and you're sifting through hundreds and years, we're talking probably about a 50 to 55 year research, maybe even more, because you died in 91, Leo, right?
No, I started researching him late, and I was looking for, after I did Bill Veeck, who's probably the most interesting guy in baseball. I was really looking. Durocher just hit me like a brick because he just his story needed to be told, and there's so many hinge points in his story, he was the Murderers Row Yankees. He was on the Gas House Gang Cardinals. He's on. He's the Giants with the Bobby Thompson home run. He's there when Jackie Robinson comes up.
Yeah, Leo, he's definitely there for the duration. Let me ask you this. How do you obtain copies from microfiche? Is there something you can press a button and it prints it out?
You can do that, yeah. And they're now microfilm now has, the real readers now have, you can put a thumb drive in there and download this thing as a PDF file onto the thumb drive. But it's interesting because I'm working on a World War II book now, and there are a lot of sources I'm going to use for that are not online. And those that are hideously expensive. I mean, you're sitting at home at your computer. You've got a very limited access to original documents. But yeah, and it's funny too. I've hired, for some of my books, I've hired young people, college kids, to sort of be interns and work for me. And it's like taking them to another planet, because I said I'm going to teach you how to use microfilm. And they look at me like, are you crazy? And they get to the Library of Congress where there's rooms full of microfilm, of obscure newspapers. And by the time they're done, they say, oh my gosh, I never knew this was true. They were so, they were going to Wikipedia for their own stuff. They say, this is amazing. And I hope we don't lose it. I hope.
Yeah, because everyone's with Wikipedia. Like you said, it's full of flaws because everyone could go in there and change the information.
Right, and people put information in there to change history. They basically they'll shade something to their own opinion. And when Obama was president, they had somebody working every day to keep cleaning up stuff that people were putting into his biography, because any hack can go in there and change it. I mean, the famous story about Wikipedia, was that Philip Roth goes on with the famous novelist goes on onto Wikipedia. He finds all these mistakes about the entry about Philip Roth. So he goes to correct him, and they said, "No, you can't touch this because you're Philip Roth." It's like you're no expert on Philip Roth. So
yeah, that is funny. You have nothing to quote or footnote regarding that. But let me ask you this about Leo. He grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts. I'm up in Massachusetts now. Have been here for 20-some-odd years since I went to law school up here. How was West Springfield like back in the 19-teens and 20s when Leo was growing up? And how did it shape him?
It shaped him in the sense that he was part of a French-Canadian culture there, and they were really, it was a booming town then. Indian was making motorcycles there. It was a big manufacturing center. Spalding, Leo's mother actually did piecework at home. She stitched baseballs because the stitching on a baseball can't be done by a machine. And he really thrived there. I mean, it was, and he gets a job in a factory, and this is how wild it was for him. I mean, he loved sports. So as a kid, he's a pool hustler to begin with, but he also plays basketball, football, and baseball. Basketball is huge in Springfield because that's where it was invented. But he goes to work in this factory that makes batteries for motorcycles, because there's several motorcycle plants in Springfield. And there's another guy there named David Redd, R-E-D-D, David Redd, who's a black man, an African-American guy, who becomes his really close friend. And Redd keeps telling him, you're really a good ball player. You should try out for the Hartford Senators, the team not that far from Springfield in Connecticut. And so Redd pushes him. He finally goes and tries out. He's sent back once. Redd pushes him back again, and he ends up with the Hartford Senators. And that's where, within days of him showing up, he shows himself to be such a colossally good defensive player, lousy hitter, but unbelievable. You would make headlines for his defensive play that it was the Cubs, the Cardinals, and the Yankees were scouting him. The Yankees signed him by the end of the year. But it's a fascinating, transformation from there to the Hartford team. And the Hartford team in those days was sort of like a farm team later. I mean, that's where Lou Gehrig went after he graduated from Columbia University, who went to Hartford. So the Yankees were all over that team as sort of a crucible for new players.
And when he came to the Yankees, there's two things I want to speak about. Number one, he really wasn't well liked about from his teammates, especially Dave, who we'll get into this in a second. The whole watch thing, he's still. But I think, as I remember from your book, this is where his introduction to gambling began around this time.
Yeah, it did. He was a pool. He played magnificent pocket billiards or pool. So he was doing that at home when he was a kid, and picking up spare change and such. But he gets to New York, And he first gets to New York in 25. Then the Yankees farm him out a little, first to Atlanta Crackers and then to the St. Paul Saints. But then he comes back as a full Yankee in 1927. Goes opening day pitch, shortstop, and then 28. But he gets into an amazing crowd in Manhattan. And Manhattan, all of Broadway was this huge gambling area. There were and drinking and it was Texas Guinea, and there were speakeasies and these things along there. He first befriends this song and dance man named George Raft, who had actually been a bat boy. And he becomes a dandy. He's like no other person they've seen. He shows up in a hotel lobby with the teams on the road. He shows up in a hotel lobby with spats and a cane. He dresses like Maurice Chevalier, and here he is, the lowliest guy rookie on the Yankees. And he does a lot of stuff there's some guys who are involved in, they're criminals, but they're not like Murder Incorporated. They're just, bookies and bootleggers. But Connie Immerman, who Connie's in Harlem, another guy named Memphis Engelberg. These are names that sound like Damon Runyon made them up. But, but his life in New York, somebody said it was like the second act of Guys and Dolls. He's going to nightclubs, he's spending heavily, he's going into debt, he's gambling, he's, staying out until 3 o'clock in the morning. And one of the reasons the Yankees hate him so much, 10 days, he's played 10 games for the Yankees, and a bunch of people, including some bookies and bootleggers, because this is the middle of Prohibition, they announced they're going to sponsor a Leo Durocher Day. And the other guys are saying, what? It takes Ruth until the last days of his life before they have a Babe Ruth Day. But here's this guy with 10 games under his belt, and they're going to have Leo Durocher Day. And his arrogance was you could cut it with a knife. And he was attacking Ruth, called Ruth dummy. He was attacking Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb complained about him because he was in the last of his career, and he would just ride the heck out of Ty Cobb.
Yeah, he was on the bases, I think. And I think, wasn't that you wrote that Babe had to go out and calm Ty Cobb down? He was ready to kill Durocher.
Yeah. But he loved that. Leo loved that, being, somebody threatening to get him and stuff. He was like, and of course he pals with George Raft, who becomes the prototypical wise guy gangster movie guy. He and Edward G. Robinson are the two guys you expect to see as gangsters in the films. And Leo so adores the influence of Raft. They have the same tailor. They live in each other's apartments in the off season, and Leo dresses exactly like Raft. I've seen pictures where they're both dressed in these beautifully tailored black suits with black knit ties, and they look like something right out of Hollywood, which Leo aspired to. George
Raft goes back to the 1930s. It's funny because I've seen a lot of his pictures. One of them, again, you expect to see James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart in the same category.
Yeah, of course.
I think George Raft played in the movie Each Dawn I Die with James Cagney. It was in a prison.
Yeah. Of course, it's.
They played gangsters that were in the jail. But if people want to know, in a funny way, and we spoke about spats and all this, go see the movie Some Like It Hot.
Yeah.
George Raft pretty much parodies himself in the film.
Absolutely.
He wears the spats, and his character's name's Spats, and everything you mentioned about Leo is pretty much in that film. He was a very natty dresser, the both of them. But he didn't fit in New York. And then I think he went to Cincinnati, and then he went to St. Louis, but he did fit in with the Gas House gang. Yeah. Why did he fit in?
But, I'm glad you mentioned the Cincinnati, because, being transferred to another league was, it's almost like being sent. In those days, it was unheard of. And it really meant you were almost exiled to the league. What was really interesting about about his time in Cincinnati was he was about gone. He owed tens of thousands of dollars in debt. He was in trouble every which way. And there's an owner there named Sidney Weil. And Weil took sort of adopted him as his prodigal son, that he thought he could change Leo and get him straight and get him back in the game full time, and he became sort of his father protector. And it was interesting because Weil was an observant Jew, and the next guy, Branch Rickey, who took him over in St. Louis, was a devout Methodist who wouldn't go to games on Sundays because of his religion. So the two guys who protect him are both men of a high religious belief who believe they can redeem him. Their belief is they can redeem him, and it's amazing because if those two guys hadn't been in there, he would have floundered. The commissioner wanted to ban him. He had so many debts, and he wasn't paying them off. But Weil in Cincinnati put him on a allowance and paid him off, and actually got him out of a jam.
Now with the Gas House gang, I mean, he fit in so well, Leo. I think he also hit well for a while as well. But this was the team of Dizzy Dean and Frankie Fish. Why do you think he got along so well with those guys?
Because they were like him. They loved brawls. They loved cheating. I mean, Durocher, to the end of his life, he used to tell about how he had a sharpened belt buckle, and he would take it was razor sharp at the top, and he would take the ball. And he'd get the ball to hand it to Dean, and as he's walking over to hand the ball to Dean, he'd gouge the ball with his belt buckle, and then Dean would throw the ball, and the ball would go loop-de-loop. And I mean, they cheated. They played practical jokes. They got their nickname because their uniforms were always dirty. They were doing a lot of head-first sliding, all the things that you weren't supposed to do back in those days, and they just played this remarkable brand of ball. And Leo, in fact, claimed, probably erroneously, but that he was the one that gave him the nickname. But it was a different kind of baseball. It was they were the exact opposite, sort of the Yankees, who really deserved pinstripes, and the Yankees were much more of an American team in the sense, one sense of the word. They were well disciplined. They were this. They were that. Whereas the Gas House gang was all over the place. They get brawls in hotels and all this stuff. And he just fit in perfectly with those guys. And then they send him, eventually have to trade him to the Brooklyn Dodgers, where again he fits in because it's sort of Brooklyn always thought of itself as the fifth largest city in America, but they had been merged with Manhattan, and Brooklyn really felt it was its own universe, and that Manhattan was a million miles away in their minds. And here comes Leo, and he's feisty, and he's getting the headlines, and he's pulling this team out of the cellar, and he just fits. He's wild, and he's a smart aleck, and he comes eventually with Branch Rickey, who everybody in Brooklyn loves. He's just, and Red Barber, and it's a strange group of people because here's Brooklyn, and they've got Red Barber with this deep Southern accent, which all sounds like a Martian in Brooklyn, but they love him because he brings all the color back to the game in Brooklyn.
And it's funny because now he's in Brooklyn, and I believe Lee McPhail was the general manager of the Dodgers at the time, if memory serves me correct. Why, with all his shenanigans, Durocher, and his big mouth, his gambling debts, of course the womenizing, and I think he was married at this time twice, if I'm not mistaken, maybe once.
To a very woman named Grace Dozier.
Yeah, why would McPhail see a possible coach in Durocher?
McPhail wanted to win at any cost, and he saw in Leo this spark, this ability to put teams together, this ability to manage by the seat of his pants, the ability to use substitution, ability to intimidate the other side, somebody to stand up to the Giants and hopefully in the World Series to stand up to the Yankees. And so he saw in him this genius, which he probably shows the greatest genius he'll ever show is probably going to be when Brooklyn gets rid of him and he goes to the Giants. But he's really a baseball guy, and he's a player manager. In fact, in those days, one of the things that appealed to McPhail and everybody, one less salary. You could use Leo as a shortstop and also as the manager. And so it was an economy move as well.
Now let me ask you this question, Paul. During the war, and I know you mentioned it in your again, baseball is just as segregated as the rest of the country. And we're talking about 42, 43. And I think Bill Veeck wanted to buy the floundering Philadelphia Phillies and pretty much stock it with African-American players from the Negro Leagues, which I have a whole site on the Negro Leagues. I've done much research on the Negro Leagues. Durocher was along the same lines as Veeck. He didn't see color. Yeah. Why do you think he didn't see color?
I think a major force in his life was David Red, who we mentioned before, the black man who was working in the factory. In fact, he's the one who pushed Durocher into baseball. And Durocher spent every time one of his teams, for the rest of his life, until David Red predeceased him, he would send David World Series tickets. He would send him money to come to New York. So he was very close to this David Red for all of his life. He also, in '39, when he first becomes manager of the Dodgers, the Daily Worker interviews him, and they ask him the question, what about integration? Because the communists in New York had already been pushing for integration as early as 37, 38. And even having in their May Day parade, they would have big signs, integrate baseball and such. But when he gets to this interview, he said, I'd really like to get, I'd like to get a bunch of these Negro athletes from the Negro Leagues and I want to bring up dark-skinned Cubans. There are a couple guys I've got an eye on, but they won't let me do it. He said the powers that be won't let me do it. Well, that's in '39, but Commissioner Landis and the other high poobahs of baseball don't read the Daily Worker. But it finally catches up to them. Like in 1942, Landis finds this quote that he gave the Daily Worker 3 years earlier and says, demands Durocher say he never said it, which Durocher refuses to do. But Durocher becomes a thorn in the side of this, and he's got all through the 40s, late 40s, they're scouting guys. They're starting to scout guys for the Dodgers, and a couple of guys they looked at just didn't pan out. But they're seriously looking for this, and they put their eyes on Jackie Robinson real early, as well as Larry Doby and a couple other people. They were looking at from really early, and they bring him up first to the Montreal Expos. Montreal. A team, not the Expos, it was the Montreal team that was a Dodger, franchise. And then, of course, they bring him up in 40, and they bring him up in 47, and he's really instrumental in getting him there. He's the famous clubhouse incident, or actually the kitchen of a hotel in Cuba, where he finds out there's a petition against the Jackie Robinson. He calls all the players into the kitchen in the middle of the night. He's in his bathrobe, and he says, I'm going to bring this guy up, and I don't care if he's what color he is. He's going to win for us, and you guys can take the petition and do something with it, which would use the petition for a sanitary purpose. So,
and something, you bring up a good point, because Branch Rickey gets all the limelight when it comes to Jackie Robinson. But Durocher is really the key here. And I think your book points out if it wasn't for Durocher, I think it would have been a lot harder for Jackie to get, especially, and we'll get into this after, Durocher was suspended for the 47 season.
Yeah. But thing about Ricky thought that he thought well of everybody. So when he signs the papers to start bringing Robinson up, he just assumes the players will accept it because he believes in his heart that all men are good, and he's had experience with black athletes when he was in college. He played with a black at Ohio Wesleyan, and so he believes, oh well, they're going to accept him, and it's only Durocher who figures out that they're not, and Durocher even goes beyond the famous thing in the kitchen. He meets with them one-on-one after one at a time. He goes through the whole team and says, look, you guys got to, I don't care what you think or what you were brought up with, you're going to accept this guy. And then he would say to them all, he'd say, look, these guys are coming up, and there's going to be a lot of them, and they're going to go after your job, and some of them are a lot better than you are, and you better get used to it. And he would turn each player around one at a time. And that's huge in his background. And he defended even in spring training. Robinson had a terrible time in the spring training 47. He goes to the Canal Zone with the Dodgers, as he's still a member of the Montreal team, but he can't sleep in the Canal Zone, which is run by the United States government. He has to go into the country of Panama, which is outside the U.S. territory, to find a place to sleep. So he's under tremendous pressure, and Durocher is sort of helping him absorb that pressure.
Let me ask you this. You brought up Judge Landis, and I also have a dead ball error site. I've done a lot of work with a dead ball. To me, Landis was a very peculiar, person. Number one, all the owners, when he became the first commissioner of baseball in 1920, they gave him unlimited powers. Now, there are three really big scandals before Pete Rose. Number one, you had the 1919 World Series, by which the Chicago White Sox, the Black Sox, whatever you want to do. That's when they called Landis in. And all of the owners bestowed supreme power on him. Now, in 1926, 1927, you had the whole thing with Ty Cobb and Chris Speaker.
Yep.
And I'm doing research on it because I'm planning to write something on it. And he let them go because, number one, he said, why are all these damn cases coming to me now when this was done before I became commissioner? And frankly, the person who accused Chris Speaker and Ty Cobb didn't present themselves until Landis literally let Cobb and Speaker slide. But now we get to 42 in the Dodgers, and we have a whole gambling fiasco going on in Brooklyn. And he tells McPhail, Judge Landis, clear house, but he did not get rid of Durocher. And I'm wondering why Landis, who Durocher was such a thorn in the side well into the 30s. I mean, everyone knew of Durocher, and Landis had many complaints. Why didn't Landis press down on McPhail to get rid of Durocher? I really think is that he, as many times as he dragged Durocher into his office and told him he had to pay off his debts. I mean, it wasn't just gambling. He owed every New York tailor. Remember Dunhill's on Fifth Avenue? He owed them a fortune. Yep.
This was that was a place where John D. Rockefeller was shopped. But I think part of Landis knew that Durocher was great box office. If the Dodgers were coming to town, and they knew that the box office would go up in that town because a lot of people came out to watch him get in a fight, argument with an umpire, or storm around the bases, or do something crazy. And I think the Prodigal Son thing came again. I think Landis felt that Durocher was salvageable, that he would find a way to sort of bring him back into the, mainstream of morality and the way people behave. Plus, even when he married, well, this is after Landis, but even his second marriage to this wonderful woman who's a dress designer, much more famous than Durocher. She was probably the most famous dress designer in America, and so he was bringing this life to baseball, and he was hanging around with the big stars. He was doing overseas trips during World War II with Danny Kaye, and then he gets involved with Sinatra in '44, and he's doing a lot of stuff for war bonds. So Landis probably looked upon him as, if you have one kid that was getting in trouble a lot, but you still love the kid, that's, I think, the relationship.
Right.
And I think it was.
And that's why he's the prodigal son.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this: we have an issue in 1947. And it happened, I think, in Cuba with McPhail and Durocher. Everyone's accusing each other of hanging out with bookies. And, what was that whole thing about?
Well, Durocher's been told by the commissioner, Happy Chandler, that he's got to stop hanging around gamblers, and he's got to break off his relationship with George Raft, who's involved in a lot of gambling stuff. And Raft knows Bugsy Siegel, and he knows all these other guys, and they hang around. And so the focus is really on Leo. But McPhail, who's now with the Yankees, has these same gamblers that have always been around Durocher, Memphis Engelberg and Connie Immerman and such, sitting in the Yankee box. But somehow Durocher gets accused of it, and things come from bad to worse. And of course the Brooklyn Eagle gets into the picture, and then so finally. Chandler sort of is in a real tough position because there's other pressure on Durocher. He's on his third wife, not even married yet, but he's living with this beautiful movie star. The Catholic Church in Brooklyn, they're going to ask the CYO to not take tickets for Catholic kids in Brooklyn. They say he's a bad moral example. He's got this gambling thing. He's involved with a divorce that's not yet legal. And finally it comes down to the fact that Chandler wants him out. In the last meeting that Chandler has with Branch Rickey and the power that be at the Dodgers, they all meet, and Happy Chandler pulls a letter out of his pocket, and he said, "There's pressure. We're going to get rid of Durocher. There's pressure from Washington." And he waves this letter in the end and puts it back in his pocket. And for decades, people heard this story and they said, aha, it was J. Edgar Hoover. But what I found in doing research on the thing, it wasn't J. Edgar Hoover. It was a guy named Frank Murphy, who was a very liberal, very devout Catholic member of the Supreme Court. So he comes from the Supreme Court to get rid of him, and that's when they banned him for a year. That was the final straw was the letter from Frank Murphy.
Yeah, Frank Murphy served on the court from 40 to 49. He was one of my favorite Roosevelt appointees. When you go back and you see the whole court packing program, of course he came out in Douglas, and he was right before, I think, in 1941 he put. I forgot on the court. His last case was Brown versus Board of Ed. He joined the liberal wing, and Murphy is an instrumental part of the court of the 1940s in doing my research on the Supreme Court. Now, we got Brooklyn, we got New York. Durocher comes back in 48. Things aren't going very well.
Well, he immediately picks a fight with Robinson. And it's not about race. It's about lifestyle. It's about, first Durocher comes back and Robinson's put on some weight during the banquet season that winter. Durocher all of a sudden calling him fatso. He's calling, he really dislikes, Robinson really dislikes Durocher. At one point he calls him a cologne-soaked bully. He wears huge amounts of aftershave. He dresses like a French movie star. He's all this stuff, and he's running all around New York at night. And Robinson's going home to his wife and kids, And it was these two guys were just from two different worlds, and they just got to really dislike each other. But by the summer, they found out. Walter O'Malley and Branch Rickey found out that Durocher was still gambling. He promised not to gamble. He's berating his own coaches. He's not getting along with his players, including most notably Robinson. And they just want to get rid of him. And they ask him to leave, and he refuses to leave. But there's a meeting in the middle of summer, and they're meeting with the Giants. And they say, you want Durocher? And they say, yep. And they take him. And overnight, he goes from Brooklyn to the Giants. But in those days, and I was alive for this. I mean, I was a kid. But it was amazing. It was the biggest headlines you'll ever see. New York Journal American had headlines 8 inches tall. And it was the first time ever a sports story was on the Dow Jones ticker when they used to have the ticker tape, go through the machines. But and for New Yorkers, it was like, it was like General Grant going down to run the Confederate Army in the middle of the Civil War. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And that's where he gets really good. That's the pinnacle of his career, because right after he gets there, the Giants acquire Henry Thompson and Monty Irvin, both African American guys, both combat veterans. Thompson has been in the Battle of the Bulge. Irvin's been in the D-Day invasion, and he realizes he can't treat these guys like kids. He would often really be rough on rookies. He can't. These are real men who have fought in combat and stuff, and he has to treat them differently, and he has to respect them. And this carries over to the next year when he gets Willie Mays, who he has the same. He realizes that to build a great team, he's got to build these guys' confidence. And when he gets Willie Mays is from a very sheltered environment, and is really coming out of the deep South in a very small town. And Durocher has to become, as he said, as Willie Mays will say years later when he gives the eulogy at Durocher's funeral, he said, he became the father I never had. And he encourages that he builds this amazing team. And, of course, we know what happened with the Bobby Thompson home run and that, and eventually winning the World Series. But that was his greatest accomplishment, I think, as a manager, was that team.
And, let me ask you this. How hard was it for Durocher to go from being Leo the Lip, just mouthing off, berating, which he would do with the Cubs later on, which we'll get to, but to literally stepping back and seeing he had to nurture the players rather than them berate them?
I think he had sort of begun to learn his lesson in Brooklyn, because they had one player revolt in '43 where he was blaming he was going to put Cookie Lavagetto on the. He's going to keep him out of 3 or 4 games because of a missed signal or something, and he was just really riding his players. And I think when he went to the Giants, he realized that he just had to change. It didn't have to be huge. I mean, he'd still go out there and argue with umpires, but he had to change in the way he was dealing with people. And he was getting a lot of these guys. He knew he had to build this Giants team, which was a wreck. And he does this magnificent job of it. I mean, he's really smart. He finds the right talent. He sticks with Mays through this huge batting slump. And Horace Stone, the owner, wants to pull Mays. And Leo goes and says to Mays, you're my guy. You're going to be one of the greatest players ever. We just got to get through this slump. He said, just rely on me. I'm not taking you out. And he became probably one of the main reasons he's in the Hall of Fame is what he did with the Giants.
And something that's very interesting, because he did stick with Mays. And Mays probably has a case of being the best player ever. And we're even including Babe Ruth up there, because I don't think anyone in his time, not even Mickey Mantle, maybe Hank Aaron, they were both chasing the record. I don't think anyone was better than Willie Mays, if you ask me. And I'm a huge Yankee fan, though.
I interviewed Monty Irvin a number of times, including right before he died the last 2 years ago. But he said that he was one of the benefactors. You could not extract a negative word from Bonnie Irvin about Durocher. And you say, well, what about this or what about this? She says, well, no. You don't understand. He was doing it with that team. He was building a great team out of nothing, and so it's interesting that he could change. It's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He could change. He became this different man, and the results were amazing. But and Irvin was one of the most admirable men I've ever met. I actually spent a day with him, but and he loved Leo as Willie did.
Yeah, Monty, I had a big celebration for him in remembrance when he died about 2 years ago. Let me ask you this: 1951, the home run with Bobby Thompson. So much speculation has gone on whether there was cheating, whether there was signal, because they had this high-powered telescope they could do and then press a button and everyone would know the signals. In your research, did you come across anything that said, well, maybe they did cheat?
No, they didn't cheat. I can tell you why. Because this whole story broke in '61 in spring training, big Associated Press thing. And Sally Evars was the guy who said, it had been cheated. And everybody came out and said no. And the most compelling piece of evidence was when Thompson was at the plate, Whitey Lockman was on second. And Whitey Lockman says, look, I couldn't break the signals. When a man's on second, you disguise your signals. They're not just basic signals. There's no way in the world a guy in the outfield with a telescope could read that signal because it was disguised. You don't just do 1, 2, 3 fingers when there's a guy on second. The guy on second's job is to steal the signal and relay it back to the batter with some other signal. And I've gone through this in 2 books now where I say, and it goes on and on and on, but there is ample evidence that everybody in baseball was cheating. There's no question there was a telescope, or actually in this case I think it were binoculars out there, but there's no way in the world they could have even physically gotten the signal in that quickly for that particular place. It was a strike and then the same pitch, 2-2. But that Lockman says, again, I trust that what he saw more than anything else, because he's staring right down the barrel of the pitch, right behind the pitcher on second base. And but everybody was cheating. Everybody was cheating. The Cleveland Indians, Bob Feller brought a telescope back from his ship in World War II, and when he wasn't pitching, he'd be sitting up in the bleachers with a telescope, snagging, reading pitches.
I know everyone was cheating, and I think with Durocher, just part of the game. Just like he wants to win. He has African Americans on tape. He'll do what it is to win. Now let me ask you this question: 54, he does win it. He's going up against the superior Cleveland Indians ball club who had just won 111 games, and yet the Giants swept them. What does Leo do to his team? How did he get the guys motivated? It's basically David versus Goliath in 54.
Yeah, but he got that team to do everything for him, and it was, and he had the city behind him at that point. They were this lovable band of guys, and they just had this. And I guess if anything, Leo gave them that was positive was sort of a chip on their shoulder. They really thought they had to prove it to the world they were good. And he just sort of lucked out in this combination of, deep Southern guys and African American guys and, Bobby Thompson, who wasn't even born in this country, and, this whole package of people. And he motivated them, and they just played their hearts out for him.
And I think he goes back to, he goes to Los Angeles, I know. And he hangs out as a coach often. Now again, he is not the show at the time. However, as you mentioned, he's on TV, he's on the Donna Reed Show, Mr. Ed, The Monsters. So he was a commentator at NBC broadcast. And now he's working for Austin in Los Angeles. How did he take, being second fiddle as a coach his relationship with Austin.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the other thing, not to forget, when he leaves the Giants, and he gets in trouble with Schotten over a comedy act, obscene comedy act, parodying Schotten, which occurs with Danny Kaye. He gets basically fired from the Giants, and then he immediately gets a contract for $75,000 from NBC, who treat him as a major talent. And they put him up against, Leo Durocher goes on the Comedy Hour, Colgate Comedy Hour, against Ed Sullivan. I mean, and they're using him to get Sinatra to show up on these shows, and he has every Hollywood connection in the world. And then in the middle of all this, he's become a major factor in television, black and white television. And it's Mr. Ed the Munsters, Beverly Hillbillies, he's on the Judy Garland show all the time. And he's part of the Rat Pack. He's part of the Rat, Sinatra's his best friend. So he gets there, and then when he gets to the Dodgers, there's the two greatest divisions in the world between the manager and the coach. But everybody in Los Angeles more or less regards Leo as the manager because he's the one who does all the television show. He's the one who's all over the place. He's appearing on these variety shows and such. But it's an unusual relationship. Because they tolerate him. They like having him out there. And some of the players really did like him out there in Los Angeles.
Yeah, you mentioned that also. But let me ask you this. Now we're going to the Cup. And again, this is mid-America. It's not New York. It's not L.A. It's not Brooklyn. We have a losing team. But we have a team with a lot of good players. Ferguson Jenkins, Ernie Banks, Ron Santo. Why did he revert back to being this kind of disciplinarian who would berate his players? And I think morale sunk so bad in '69. It is one of the greatest collapses. But in your opinion, do you think Durocher steered the ship the wrong way and mismanaged the '69 Cubs? Or do you think that was a team that was really tired?
No, I think he wrecked the team. And I think what he did was he came into Chicago, and the first target he had was Ernie Banks. And he tried to get rid of Ernie Banks, and he insulted Ernie Banks. And he basically worked to demoralize that team. And even in '69, talking to players, reading oral histories like Ferguson Jenkins, he did everything he could to demoralize that team. He refused to use his bench. Pitcher had come to him and said, "Skipper, my shoulder's hurt and I can't go a full game tonight. You have to pull me early in the game. My shoulder's killing me." He'd leave him in the game as punishment for complaining. He abandoned the team once during the middle of the pennant race. He said he's going home sick right in the middle of the game. He said, "I'm really sick. I got to go home." Everybody's, the Wrigleys that own the team sent a doctor to his house. They're very concerned. Well, he's flown off in a private jet to his stepson's camp in Wisconsin, which was Camp Ojibwe, which was also the Alan Sherman, "Hello, Mother, Hello, Father," that thing. That was the camp. And he goes there, and he expecting nobody will know. There's parents there who immediately get on the phone. "Hey, Durocher just showed up," that big welcome Leo signs. And that night he's going to fly back for the next day's game. The airport in this town is fogged in. He can't leave. So he misses a second game. And the players are furious with him. He not only does he desert the team in the middle of the game, but he lies about it. Says he's sick. And the Wrigleys don't do anything. They sort of said it was a bad thing to do. And the players are saying, "Wait a second. If I'd done that, I'd be suspended for baseball forever," And in the meantime, he's picked up these enemies on the team. He really hates Santo. And if you read his autobiography, which is a huge pack of falsehoods, Nice Guys Finish Last, he spends, I think it's 11 pages in that book, ripping apart Ernie Banks and Ron Santo. Now, who are the two most beloved players who ever played for the Chicago Cubs? Ernie Banks and Ron Santo. And And what he finally does, in 1970, there's a Playhouse Revolt in Chicago with the Cubs, and Santo tries to kill him. Santo gets his arm around his neck and is trying to break his neck. They have to break it up. I mean,
it's
couldn't make that up in a novel.
It's amazing. It's an end month. So he was about 64 at the time. Durocher around that time. That was the year I was born, 1970. I know what you're thinking.
But you know what did it for Santo? Santo was a gentle man, and Santo had diabetes. And Santo goes to this is in 69, and 68. This is before the big season. But he goes to the Wrigley family and he says, I'm going to tell everybody in the world I've got diabetes. It's a deep secret, but I want us to have a special day in which I make the announcement and we give part of the gate receipts that day to Diabetes Foundation. And Leo gets wind, and the Wrigley said, we're all in, we're going to do that, we're going to raise money for an awareness for diabetes. And Durocher gets wind of it, and he thinks it's Santo being an egotist. And he goes screaming, he said, we don't have, what right have you to have a Ron Santo Day? We don't have a Leo Durocher Day, and you're having your little special day, and he berates him for it. He misses the whole point. It's not about Santo, it's about diabetes. And so you follow this stuff, and you say, how could he be that stupid? I mean, Durocher.
Reading your book, you come to the conclusion. He was definitely a man of contradictions.
Yes.
Definitely a man. He wanted players to come in. He didn't see color. Yet he would make it hard on some. He would have his favorites and stuff. It's just a clash, like you mentioned before, like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of personality. It would come out in the most awkward of all moments, to tell you the truth. When you read your book, you're like, oh my God, Leo, what the hell are you doing? Yeah. As we get along to the end of the book, he's now in Houston, player's strength. And this is what struck me in your book. Leo was a traditionalist. He did believe in the reserve clause. He did believe in that. He berated his players. He berated Leo, for God's sake. The guy should belong in the Hall of Fame with Leo because of this whole union thing, which he really didn't get.
He really hated them by then. And the great irony of it all was he was the largest benefactor of the Players' Pension Fund, which had started under it started under Happy Chandler, but he hated Marvin Miller. He hated the players. When he gets to Houston, he can't stand these guys like Larry Durker, who are smart and don't take guff from him. And so he doesn't like this new breed of player who, he's expect the players to sit in a corner and he could yell at them and they won't come back at him. And the players, he just hates the union, he hates the salaries, he hates the arrogance of the young players, which is much, much, much less arrogant than he is. And the players get to him. The famous thing the players would do is Lee would come into the clubhouse. He said, I had a drink with Frank last night, and he says so-and-so. And the whole team in unison would yell out, Frank who? And, of course, he was talking about Frank Sinatra. And then he'd get really mad at him because they wouldn't acknowledge his friendship with Frank Sinatra. It was sad. It was really sad. It was like watching a great guy. I think from the time he got to the Cubs until the end, he had really lost that amazing ability to win and an amazing ability to become a leader.
Let me ask you this. In writing the book, in spending time with Leo for about 2 years, because you literally had to become part of what Leo, you had to think of Leo, you had to drink of Leo, you had to sleep on Leo. Did you like Leo in the end, after all the research and all the stuff you wrote about him?
No. If I was sitting in a first class part of an aircraft, a commercial aircraft, and I was sitting and I found out Leo was sitting next to me, I'd ask the flight attendant to move me to coach if there was a seat. I probably couldn't stand being around him. He was so easily attack somebody and just go after them. I thought I liked him in the sense that he was a character. And so I end up with a book. I loved him as a character. I end up with a book with, Greta Garbo and Trujillo and Batista and Hubert Humphrey and in the index, along with Mr. Ed the Talking Horse. I mean, he was, if I was a novelist, I could have made this stuff up. If I had written it, people would have said, no, that can't happen. He doesn't end up in this famous flight with Greta Garbo where she says, I mean, it's just that kind of thing for a guy. And I love the fact that I could start a book in Prohibition in New York City with all the speakeasies and end up in Houston at, in the space age. It had all those places to do, Chicago and New York and Brooklyn and L.A. and just, Hollywood. So that from a, theatrical standpoint, he's just marvelous. But would I like to sit next to him on a plane? No.
That's interesting. Now, let me ask you this final question, and then I'll ask you after I ask this question if I missed anything that you wanted to tell the listeners.
Sure.
Durocher died in 91. And then, of course, it took about 3 years for him to get in the Hall of Fame. Do you think he belongs there?
Yeah, I do. There's I'll make arguments against it, but I think the totality of his career, both as a player, both as a key player, especially in St. Louis and early in the Dodgers, and his managerial record, which is quite good. One of the best ever. He deserved it, and I think ironically, he did. The business with race that's where the Dr. Jekyll comes out strongest. He really does make it possible for Jackie Robinson to come up. He really does make it possible for those Giants team to excel with Mays, Thompson, and Irvin. And I think, and even his early advocacy of integration. So I think on balance he deserved it. But it was such a debate during the years he was up there. I mean, I got on a plane one day and I read the In-Flight magazine. The big article in the In-Flight magazine is, does Leo Durocher belong in the Hall of Fame? And it was a national issue. And columnists, major columnists for the papers would be either against or for him. And it was astonishing to see the debate because so many people disliked him and other people admired him for the things that he did that were good.
And I never ever mention this because it's so much debated for the last 30 years. Pete Rose had a gambling issue.
Yeah,
he took the whole thing and said, "Look, I'll be banned for baseball for what I did." The Giamatti. Now, of course, in every clubhouse, gambling is a 1-year suspension. Rose took a lifetime ban. For what he did on the field, Rose, I think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. You could always make a paradox here with Leo saying, Leo. I mean, God knows what Leo did. Maybe he did bet on his own teams. You'll never know. You'll never know from Pete Rose, although he says he didn't. I think Pete should be in the Hall of Fame, too, if Leo's there.
It's an interesting argument. I think the reason that Rose is not in the Hall of Fame was he was offered redemption. He was offered if he agreed to arrange to pay his debts and stop gambling, and he didn't take it. And so, there are other people, Len Dykstra and others, who worked with Major League Baseball to clear their names, who had gambling problems, and he didn't. He would not work with them, and I think that's really the reason that he's still banned. I think he could have taken a pledge and worked out an arrangement to pay off some of the gambling debts. Because I talked to the attorneys that were involved in that whole case, and people's legs got broken and for debts that weren't being paid and stuff. So it's a complicated issue, and it was much more of a public issue. But you can make the case. You can make the case. I'm not saying you can't.
You could.
But Leo's clubhouse, it was literally fit. When he gets to the Dodgers as his manager, There are bookies in the clubhouse. There are bookies in the dugout. So a player would come in from the pitching in the fifth inning and say, put $50 on so and so at Hialeah, because they were playing afternoon games and the races were in the afternoon. And they're taking bets. You know, it's amazing. I mean, the whole baseball, except for certain teams that really kept themselves clean, but a lot of teams were highly into gambling, and during that period, and bookies were all over the place. And these weren't, these guys weren't fixing horse races. Although there's a guy that does associate with Durocher named Sleep Out Louis Levinson, who's involved in some really, really marginal things like fixing horse races.
You read your book, and I'm still fascinated about Leo, especially, a guy that could be so fiery to be also Mr. Personality. And something, the thing with Danny Kaye taking his thing out and stuff, you would never know that from Danny Kaye. You watch White Christmas every year, and you're like, wow, what a great guy he is, He's the only guy.
I know. But, and when he traveled with Kaye, Kaye's wife was a comedy writer. And I think he got a lot of his ability to go into an audience, an after-dinner speaker, and have him rolling in the aisles, was she taught him how to deliver a comic line. I mean, that's the other thing about him. He lives this other life as a Hollywood Broadway celebrity, who's paid huge amounts of money to go and give a speech. And because they know they're going to get their money's worth. He's going to tell stories, and people are going to leave with tears in their eyes from crying. From laughing.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating character. Let me ask you this, Paul, did I miss anything that you might want to tell the folks at home?
Not really. I think we covered a lot of stuff, and I really appreciate it.
Well, I hope you had a good time. I hope my questions were analytical, like I told you they would be in the beginning. I just don't read a book without asking the question why, or where did you get this from?
No, they're great questions, Ian, and I really appreciate it. And so this will probably go up as a podcast later this week?
It'll come out probably in a week and a half. I got about 4 other shows I got to get out.
Okay.
But what'll happen is I'll send it to you on instant message. It'll be posted in all my sites, including my own site. I'm followed by about 40,000 people.
Wow.
At this end, so a lot of people always take my recommendations. I'm sure you're going to get more sales from this. Hold the line, Paul. Hold the line. This is how I end the show. Just hold the line. I want to just say a few words after I end the show. Folks, I had a great time with Paul Dickson. Man's written 65 books. His new book, Leo Durocher, Baseball's Prodigal Son, must read. Of course, I say that about all my authors, but I had a great time with Leo. I learned a lot of new things. Go out, buy his book. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. I'm in for Marc Weiss, who has busted his arm, unfortunately. Cole has busted his arm. So he's going to be laying low for a while. But in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time. And have a great day.